The Great Siege of Malta is probably one of my favorite sieges of all time because the Maltese successfully repelled the invaders even though they were seriously outnumbered. This siege was very important. It pretty much decided the fate of Europe. Malta is a tiny Mediterranean country at the southern tip of Europe, right near northern Africa. It was one of the first nations in Europe to embrace Christianity. Malta is a natural fortress. All of the forests were cut down hundreds of years ago, leaving it completely barren with a surface of rock and soft sandstone, unfit to grow corn or any other grain. Except for a few springs in the middle of the island, there is no running water or wells. The Maltese are very strong and courageous. They are Mediterraneans who have some Arab admixture. In the 1500s, they were used to fighting off Turkish raiders all of their lives. At this time in history, the Muslim Ottoman Turks were absolutely ruthless. They had conquered the entire Middle East and sacked the greatest city in the world at that time, Constantinople, now renamed Istanbul. They massacred the entire Christian population there. They loved to loot everything they could and capture civilians to enslave them. They were depopulating entire villages, attacking coastal towns of Italy, France, Spain, and even seizing white slaves from as far away as Iceland. Ultimately, over 1.1 million Christian Europeans were kidnapped and enslaved by the Turkish pirates between 1500 and 1800. The Siege of Malta was a very pivotal part of Europe's history. The Christians of Europe kept the Muslims at bay for over 500 years. If Malta was taken over, the entirety of Europe would very likely be forced to convert to Islam due to being conquered. During the siege, Queen Elizabeth of England declared, "If the Turks shall prevail against the Isle of Malta, it is uncertain what further peril might follow the rest of Christendom." If Malta was taken, the Turks would have likely went straight to Sicily and would have made their way up Italy to mainland Europe. Malta and another small island nearby named Gozo was given to the Knights of St. John by Charles V of Spain so they can practice their faith in peace and protect the island from the Muslim Ottoman Turks nearby. Before settling in Malta, they were forced out of their island of Rhodes by a successful Ottoman invasion in 1522. On the island of Rhodes, 7,000 knights and soldiers resisted over 90,000 Sultan forces for 6 months. They were forced to withdraw from battle when all their supplies were exhausted. The knights were vulnerable in Malta despite having 2 large harbors and forts due to its location. If Malta fell, the Order of St. John would have been finished since they would have nowhere else to go. The aging Grand Master, Jean de la Valette, who was a French nobleman who fought in Rhodes, recognized that Malta was in danger due to its strategic location, so he improved all the existing defenses and constructed new ones. He also tried to restore the Order's finances. He constructed 2 new forts, Fort St. Michael and Fort St. Elmo. Now Malta had 3 forts, and they were crucial during the Great Siege of 1565. Suleiman the Magnificent, the greatest Ottoman emperor and one of the greatest commanders of military history, decided that he would attempt to capture Malta. After he was done with Malta, he planned on taking all of Europe. The Knights of St. John, who also became known as the Knights of Malta, would not allow Malta to have the same fate as Rhodes. During the winter of 1564 to 1565, the Turkish army made their preparations to invade and conquer. The Sultan appointed Mustafa Pasha, a fanatical Muslim who was well known for his violence and cruelty, who also fought in the Siege of Rhodes, to help him command the Ottoman army that would attempt to take over Malta. The Sultan also appointed a Croatian Muslim convert, Piali, to be the Admiral-in-Chief of the fleet. Before beginning their assault, Suleiman and his commanders awaited on a naval commander named Dreget, who was also known as the Dawn Sword of Islam, the greatest pirate warrior of all time, and the uncrowned king of the Mediterranean, for his military skill and successful raids on the Italian coastline, carrying off thousands of Italians into slavery. Years before, in 1551, Dreget attempted to invade Malta with 10,000 men. The attempt failed, so they targeted the island of Gozo, neighboring Malta, where they took the entire population of 5,000 civilians into captivity. This reasonably angered the Maltese people. In the autumn of 1564, Valette's spy gave him intel that a huge armada was heading for Malta. He sent a messenger to spread the news throughout Europe. The Pope gave La Valette 10,000 crowns. This helped him buy more armaments, but it didn't help the fact that Malta needed more soldiers. The Ottomans had over 48,000 fighting men in total, consisting of 6,300 Janissaries, who were the finest troops in the Turkish army. They were taken from Christian families as boys by force, castrated and forced to convert to Islam, and then served in a slave army. They had over 6,000 Safis, which are cavalry, 4,000 religious fanatics, which would probably be called jihadists today, 2,500 Safis from Romania, 500 Safis from Karamania, 6,000 other volunteers, thousands of slaves, and various corsairs from Tripoli and Algiers. The Turkish fleet consisted of 193 vessels, including 131 galleys, 7 galleots, and they had 11 huge merchant ships accompanying the fleet, one of which alone carried 600 fighting men, 6,000 barrels of powder, and 1,300 rounds of cannonballs. Grand Master La Valette did not imagine that the Ottoman fleet coming at him in Malta would be so large. La Valette had under his command only 700 knights and sergeants, 400 Spanish soldiers, 800 Italian soldiers, 200 Greek and Sicilian soldiers, and around 3,000 Maltese soldiers, along with armed civilians, totaling an army of around 9,000 men. They were completely outnumbered. In mid-May, La Valette called everybody together to give a speech. This would be the last chance he would have to speak to all the knights in one great assembly before they would go off to fight a bloody battle. He said, "It is the great battle of the cross and the Quran which is now to be fought. A formidable army of infidels are on the point of invading our island. We, for our part, are the chosen soldiers of the cross, and if heaven requires the sacrifice of our lives, there can be no better occasion than this. Let us hasten then, my brothers, to the sacred altar. There we will renew our vows and retain by our faith in the sacred sacraments that contempt for death which alone can render us invincible." When the knights left the church, they were filled with enthusiastic joy. It was reported that after the service, every kind of weakness disappeared. All divisions between them, all private animosities ceased. The Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem were devout, aristocratic, and warlike. On May 18, 1565, Ottoman ships reached Malta and the Great Siege began. The invaders were extremely confident that they would be able to overwhelm and subjugate the Knights. Solomon was promised by his general and his admiral that the island of Malta would be taken within 3 or 4 days of combat. They were very, very wrong. Fort St. Elmo was their first target because it dominated the entrance to the Grand Harbor. 100 knights and soldiers held Fort St. Elmo. They were ordered by La Valette to fight to the last man. Its garrison, aware that the length of their survival would determine the outcome of the whole campaign, hung on as men died and walls collapsed under the day and night of bombardment. At this time, word reached La Valette that the relief he hoped for from nearby Sicily had been seriously delayed. Valette read the dispatch to his council and declared, "We now know that we cannot look to others for our deliverance. It is only upon God and our own swords that we must rely. Yet this is no reason to be disheartened. Rather the opposite. For it's better to know the truth of one's situation than to be deceived by false hopes. Our faith and our honor of our order are in our own hands. We shall not fail." Fort St. Elmo could not hold out indefinitely, but they lasted an incredible 35 days of constant bombardment and waves of assault. The knights who died defending Fort St. Elmo gave time to consolidate the defenses of the other forts. The Turkish commander Dreget was fatally injured during the taking of Fort St. Elmo, as Mustafa Pasha carried the banner of Sultan Suleiman to replace the flag of St. John at St. Elmo's ruins. He gazed at the massive Fort St. Angelo across the bay and cried, "Allah! If so small a son has cost us so dear, what price shall we have to pay for so large a father?" The 35 days of ferocious courage of the defenders of Fort St. Elmo had cost the invaders precious time and over 9,000 of their best troops. Francisco Balbi, a Spanish relief soldier, says, "The darkness of the night then became as bright as day due to the vast quantity of artificial fires. So bright it was indeed that we could see St. Elmo quite clearly. The gunners of St. Angelo were able to lay and train their places upon the advancing Turks, who were picked out in the light of the fires." Mustafa Pasha ordered the bodies of the knights to be decapitated. Their heads were placed on stakes, and their corpses were nailed to crosses to be floated across the harbor. As the headless bodies of the crucified knights washed up on the base of Fort St. Angelo, Evalion ordered their Turkish prisoners to be executed and their heads to be used as cannonballs to bombard the Turks. The message was clear: the knights would fight to the very death. No quarter would be given and none would be received. The advance force from Sicily arrived despite the fate of St. Elmo. The Italians managed to evade the Turkish blockade and land their small relief force of 42 knights and 700 militia. Although it wasn't much, it was quite useful. The battle for St. Angelo saw some of the bloodiest episodes of this holy war. Mustafa Pasha was to launch some 10 attacks on the walls of St. Angelo and the fortified 3 cities throughout the long, hot summer of 1565. The knights, their luck holding out, were warned by a Turkish deserter about a plan for Sangalia to be attacked from the south on July 15th, and this gave the order time to build a line of defensive stakes which successfully repulsed the attack. Following the humiliation of July 15th, Mustafa adopted a more cautious approach, depending upon his artillery to reduce the walls and undermine the morale of the defenders by incessant bombardment from all directions. The Christian fortresses came under withering and sustained artillery barrage. The bombardment continued all day and night throughout the last week of July. At dawn of August 2nd, the Turks advanced while all their cannons thundered at once. People in Sicily over 100 kilometers away could hear the cannon fire. It was the heaviest bombardment of the siege. From every ridge and slope, the enemy swarmed forward like a tidal wave against the garrisons. Yet attack after attack was repulsed, and Mustafa was once again forced to concede defeat. As his exhausted and decimated assault troops withdrew, Mustafa decided to subject the Christians to a further 5 days of continuous bombardment before attempting the next assault. While the Turkish attack on St. Angelo was routed, their assault on St. Michael was succeeding. Turkish flags began to appear among the ramparts. It was at this point that the governor of Medina, the capital of Malta, launched his cavalry force against the light-guarded Turkish headquarters. The Christians overwhelmed the sentries, killing every man that they could find, capturing or destroying a huge store of provisions and ammunition. As a messenger galloped up to Mustafa to inform him that a large Christian force had swarmed their camp, Mustafa feared the worst. He assumed that this was the relief force from Sicily. Mustafa ordered a general retreat. In this way, Fort Michael was saved. However, there was no relief force. Evalion called his council together that night and informed his men, "I will tell you now openly, my brethren, that there is no hope to be looked for except in the Almighty God, the only true help. He is the one who looked after us until now, and he will not forsake us, nor will he deliver us into the hands of the enemies of the holy faith. We are soldiers, and we shall die fighting. If by any evil chance the enemy should prevail, we can expect no better treatment than our brethren who are in St. Elmo. Let no man think that there can be any question of receiving honorable treatment or escaping with his life. If we are beaten, we shall be killed. It would be better to die in battle than terribly at the hands of the Muslims." On August 18th, when a huge part of the defenses were breached, the Ottomans failed to take the fort. Evalion himself had even entered the battle fray, and despite the uneven odds of success, he had refused to accept the Ottomans' terms of surrender. The Ottomans began to tunnel under the defenses to plant mines. With a tremendous explosion, the bastion of Castile and Sangalia collapsed. As the survivors staggered back in confusion, waves of Turks swarmed through the breach. Evalion boldly ran from his command post towards the breach. Seeing the Grand Master running in the point of danger, all the knights and soldiers joined him, turning back the tide of Islamic advance. A grenade exploded near Evalion and the knights rushed to defend him. "Withdraw, sire, to a place of safety." Evalion refused. "The enemy is already in retreat." Evalion continued to advance against the enemy, declaring, "As long as their banners still wave in the wind, I will not withdraw." The knights and soldiers surged forward with an incredible tenacity until, within a few minutes, the Turks were routed and fleeing in disarray. There was no darkness that night as gunfire lit up the sky and cannons pounded the walls. Yet the Christians stood firm, and by dawn the Turks withdrew in defeat. Now Mustafa unleashed a siege tower, which was higher than the walls. Janissaries used its platform to fire upon the defenders of Birgu. Evalion had his workmen burrow a hole in the base of the wall facing the tower. They wheeled out a large cannon which fired 2 large cannonballs fastened together with a chain. It sliced through the structure, causing it to collapse. spilling the Turks incendiary grenades and fuel, which set the giant tower ablaze. On August the 20th, the Turks brought up another larger siege engine, reinforced at the base with earth and stonework. The Knights of St. John stormed the tower, eliminating the Janissaries in a matter of minutes. They then turned the siege engine into an additional fighting platform to defend their walls. The 2 Turkish cannons on it poured fire into the dismayed Ottomans. At this point, Mustafa learned that a large supply ship from North Africa to replenish their dwindling supplies of ammunition and food had been captured by a Christian galley. Despondency swept the Turkish camp. They were now running so short of gunpowder that they had to suspend the bombardment. Thousands of Turks were laid low with sickness. Even water and food was in short supply for the attackers. Mustafa was determined to capture the capital Medina and use it as his winter quarters. Anticipating the Turkish intentions, the governor of Medina dressed the civilians in soldiers' uniforms and had them patrol the ramparts along with the garrison. All available cannon were brought to the side to which the Turkish assault would approach. As the Muslims toiled up the long slopes to the city, they were shocked to see the walls bristling with cannon and armed men. As they came within range, the cannon opened fire. The dismayed Turks halted and turned back and said, "It's another St. Elmo!" The Turks launched another attack on St. Angelo and St. Michael on the 1st of September, but their men were by now so drained and disheartened, reduced in numbers and sick with fever and dysentery, that the attack failed almost right before it began. "It is not the will of Allah that we shall become masters of Malta," was the general consensus. On the 5th of September, Viceroy Don Garcia set sail from Sicily with a relief force made up of professional soldiers from all over Europe, including many Italians, Germans, French, and other European volunteers. The relief consisted of 10,000 fighting men and 28 ships. When news of the relief arrived on the 8th of September, Mustafa's army was on the verge of mutiny. The Turkish fleet had lost the will to fight and did not even attempt to contest the landing. By September, the Ottomans were concerned about having to remain in Malta during the winter. Remember that this is a time period before they had food preservatives and modern medicine. The Ottoman troops were exhausted and their morale was low. At this point, Valet's long-awaited relief forces appeared at Malha Bay and took control of high ground inland, almost trapped the Ottoman troops retreated, but not before losing thousands more men. As the invaders began to embark, Mustafa learned that the relief force was actually smaller than his army, so he ordered his men back ashore. The relief force charged them, and in a fierce battle slaughtered 3,000 of Mustafa's army, driving the remainder to sea. The day the Turks fled Malta was September the 11th. During the siege of Malta, over 130,000 cannonballs were fired towards defenders and civilians for 4 hot summer months. A third of the defenders and population of Malta perished, but they withstood the siege. The Sultan Suleiman was angered and devastated when he heard of his army being defeated. He said, "Next year, I myself, Sultan Suleiman, will lead an expedition against this accursed island. I will not spare one single inhabitant." Fortunately for the Maltese, he died before he could carry out his threat. At the beginning of his reign, he had been defeated before the walls of Vienna in 1529. Now at the end of his reign, his army had suffered the most humiliating and decisive defeat ever at Malta. The Ottomans never again attempted to take the island. The Great Siege officially ended on the 8th of September, which became a national holiday for Malta, and Malta's beautiful capital, Valletta, was founded and named after Grandmaster Jean Valette. Unfortunately, he didn't live to see the city completed. When he died, La Valette was buried in a great crypt in the Cathedral of St. John, where the inscription reads, "Here lies La Valette, the scourge of Africa and Asia, the shield of Europe. He expelled the barbarians by his holy arms." The heroic defense of Malta against such an overwhelming odds for over 4 months of relentless bombardment and assault inspired all of Europe to defeat the Ottoman menace. There were a few cases of French, Spanish, and German soldiers joining the Turks, but there were no cases of the Maltese joining their enemy. Currently, Malta has the highest Catholic Church attendance in any country in Europe. Much of the first season of Game of Thrones was filmed in Malta. It's a beautiful little country that I hope to see one day. Thanks for watching, guys. Stay tuned for more European history videos. I really love creating them, and stay sane.